Welcome to this week's lecture on career theory through a critical and culturally sustaining lens. I'm Dr. Kari Swan, and over the next 20 minutes, we're going to ask a question that doesn't always get asked in textbooks. Whose lives are these theories actually built for? That question, whose theory is not merely academic. It shapes every conversation you'll have with a client about their future. Let's begin with something that might sound provocative, but is actually foundational. No theory is neutral. Every career framework you've studied this semester was built by a particular person at a particular moment in history inside a particular cultural and economic world, and that context leaves fingerprints. Holland developed RISEC in mid-20th century America, a world structured by clear racial hierarchies, restricted access to education for many communities, and deeply gendered assumptions about who worked where and why. Super formulated his lifespan model in a context where a linear, orderly career trajectory was the assumed norm, provided you were white, male, and college educated. These frameworks reflect real patterns, but they were never universal. When we treat them as if they are, we risk measuring our clients against a yardstick that was never made for them. That is the foundational problem this entire presentation is built around. Here is what you are building toward this week, framed precisely in terms of our CROP 2024 standard. Standard 3, D. 1 requires that you understand multicultural and social justice frameworks as they apply to career counseling. Today's learning objective lives inside that standard. You will be able to critique the cultural assumptions embedded in both matching and developmental career models. Notice the verb critique. In Bloom's taxonomy, that places us at the evaluate level. This is not description, it is analysis and judgment. And this is exactly what the Where It Falls Short column in your group comparison chart is asking you to demonstrate. Keep that connection in mind as we move through the content. Here is a map of where this presentation is going, organized into 4 interconnected sections that build on each other. First, we'll identify the shared DNA, 4 assumptions that Holland, Super, and Gottfredson all carry, often invisibly. Second, we'll examine each assumption individually, holding it against the reality of diverse lives. Third, we'll make the case for keeping these theories but holding them differently through what I'm calling a both-and stance. And fourth, we'll translate that stance into specific, culturally sustaining practice moves you can use with clients. Use this map as your navigation anchor as we go. Despite their differences in focus and structure, Holland, Super, and Gottfredson emerged from the same general moment in American social science, and they share 4 foundational assumptions. What makes these assumptions tricky is that they don't announce themselves as assumptions. They present as facts as the natural order of things. The first is the autonomous chooser, the idea that career is a personal decision made by a self-directing individual. The second is the stable inner self, the belief that a fixed, discoverable essence exists and can be matched to the right environment. The third is the open field, the assumption that opportunity is broadly accessible and the counselor's primary job is helping with the matching. The fourth is the universal timeline, the idea that one orderly developmental sequence applies to everyone in roughly the same order and tempo. None of these is simply wrong. But each is partial, and in that partiality, each can cause real harm. Let's slow down on assumption 1, because it may be the most consequential of the 4. Matching models and developmental models alike picture the career decision maker as a lone individual, someone who consults their internal preferences, weighs their options, and selects the best fit for themselves. That image carries deep roots in Western individualism. But consider how many of your future clients will make decisions in fundamentally different terms. For many Indigenous clients, for many immigrant families, and for many clients from collectivist cultural traditions, a career decision is not a solo act. It is a relational one. A young woman who declines a scholarship in another city to remain near an aging grandparent is not failing to individuate. She is honoring a value system that a RIASEC profile will never capture. When we hold autonomy as the default frame, we risk pathologizing those clients as enmeshed, as lacking differentiation, or as not yet ready. The counselor's task here is to hold the relational frame as legitimate, not as a barrier to overcome, but as a valid structure for decision-making. Now let's consider assumption 2, the idea that the career field is essentially open and accessible. Gottfriedsen's model is actually the most honest of the three about the role of context. She uses the language of circumscription to describe how aspiration narrows over time. But even her framework tends to locate that narrowing inside the individual's psychology. What structural analysis adds, and what multicultural career scholars like Blustein instead insist on, is the concept of the opportunity structure. This is the actual landscape of open and closed doors. Which schools have college preparatory programs, which neighborhoods have economic vitality, and which industries have histories of exclusion. When a client tells you they never really thought about medicine, a counselor working only from a matching framework hears a preference. A counselor with a structural lens asks a different question: what fenced that door in the first place? Acknowledging structural barriers is not pessimism, it is the precondition for meaningful advocacy. Supra's LifeSpace model gives us something genuinely valuable, a way of understanding career development as unfolding across time rather than being fixed at a single assessment point. But embedded in the model is the assumption of a universal age-graded sequence: growth, exploration, establishment, maintenance, and disengagement, in roughly that order, on a roughly predictable schedule. Real lives are far more irregular. Consider the client who spent her 20s as a primary caregiver after her mother became ill. Consider the formerly incarcerated person re-entering the workforce at 40. Consider the refugee who navigated statelessness for a decade before ever having the resources to think about career exploration. These are not people who are delayed. They are people whose development was shaped by forces the model doesn't account for. When we apply super stages prescriptively, we import a judgment about whose life trajectory is normal, and that judgment typically reflects a white, Western, middle-class template. The fourth assumption concerns the instruments themselves. Holland's RISAC codes and the interest inventories that operationalize them are grounded in a substantial body of research. But that research was conducted largely on Western, industrialized, predominantly white samples, and the structure of the instruments reflects that history. Here is a concrete illustration. Meta-analytic research by Sue, Rounds, and Armstrong in 2009 found large replicated sex differences in measured interests, with women clustering higher in social and artistic domains and men higher in things and data. Those differences do not necessarily reflect deep innate preferences. They reflect decades of socialization about what is available and approved for women versus men in particular cultural contexts. The same logic applies across cultural context more broadly. A client's social score may reflect what she was encouraged toward in her community, not the full range of what she might have pursued in a different environment. The clinical implication is direct. Before you hand someone an interest profile, explicitly discuss the norming population and what the assessment cannot see about your client's cultural world. Present every score as a starting conversation, never a ceiling. I want to stay with the idea of history for a moment because it is central to understanding some of your clients in ways that theory alone cannot provide. The quote on this slide comes from Elena Skye, our composite case character for the week. Her grandmother was sent to a federal Indian boarding school, a system explicitly designed to sever Indigenous children from their language, their families, and their cultural identity. That history does not stay in the past. It lives in bodies, in families, in communities, and in the felt sense of what institutions like schools and career counseling offices represent. For many Indigenous clients, the word career sits inside that history. A model-driven assessment session that does not acknowledge this will misread hesitation as resistance, silence as disengagement, and ambivalence as a motivation problem. The counselor who centers sovereignty, resilience, and cultural knowledge reframes the entire interaction, and that reframing begins before the first assessment instrument is introduced. Here's where I want to be direct with you. The goal of everything we have covered so far is not to discard Holland, Super, and Gottfriedsen. Critique sharpens use. It does not cancel it. Each of these frameworks, held with appropriate humility, continues to offer genuine explanatory power. Holland still gives us a common vocabulary for talking about interest patterns, and interest profiles remain useful starting points for conversation as long as we hold scores loosely and ask what shaped them. Super still gives us the arc of development across the lifespan, and the concept of an evolving self-concept is clinically rich, especially when stages are treated as flexible rather than prescriptive. Gottfredson still gives us the construct of circumscription, the fencing of aspiration, and that construct is powerful precisely because it names a process. When you can name how aspiration narrows, you can begin the work of expanding it. The theories are not the problem. Using them uncritically is. What I am inviting you toward is what I call a both-and stance. This is not a compromised position or a watered-down middle ground. It is a disciplined way of holding theory and client together simultaneously. Theory provides structure, vocabulary, and pattern recognition across many clients and contexts. The client provides irreplaceable authority over the meaning of their own life. The counselor's role is to serve as a bridge between the two, knowing when to lean on the theoretical vocabulary because it is helping the client make sense of their experience, and knowing when to lay it down because it is obscuring more than it reveals. When theory and the client's lived experience conflict, weight the client's cultural and relational knowledge heavily. The person sitting across from you is the expert on what their life has been and what it means. Theory is a lens, not a verdict. Let's make this concrete. These 4 practice moves are not techniques layered onto a career counseling session after the real work is finished. They are the architecture the session is built inside. First, ask who else is in the decision. Make space for kin, community, and relational obligation as legitimate participants in the process, not obstacles to individual self-actualization. Second, name the instrument's limits allowed before you share any results. Explicitly discuss the norming population and what the assessment cannot see about your client's cultural context. Third, let the client's own cultural and relational priorities reorder the options, rather than forcing their priorities through a framework they did not author. Fourth, start from strengths and sovereignty. Lead with resilience and cultural knowledge rather than introducing them as correctives after a deficit framing has already shaped the conversation. These moves do not require a new theory. They require a different orientation to the work. Let's bring everything together through Alina Skye. She is a young Indigenous woman from a rural community navigating career decisions within a web of family obligation, historical trauma, and limited local opportunity. Notice how each theory both illuminates and obscures her experience. Holland names her social and artistic strengths, a useful clinical vocabulary for beginning a conversation, but it cannot see that she already enacts those strengths every day in her community, unpaid and uncounted by any inventory. Super helps us distinguish that her exploration stage was interrupted, not absent, a meaningful reframe that separates pause from failure, but the model can still imply she is off schedule against a normative template she was never meant to fit. Gottfredson reveals that her aspirations were fenced by structural forces well beyond her control. But if we stop there, we risk a deterministic reading that erases her agency, her resilience, and her sovereignty. Each theory is useful, none is sufficient. Together, held critically and in combination, they offer a richer and more honest frame for the counseling work. Now let's connect this directly to your work this week. Your group comparison chart has 4 columns across 3 theories. The first asks you to name what each theory genuinely contributes, what it helps a counselor see or do that they could not without it. The second asks where each theory falls short for a client of color in a rural setting. The third requires that every critique be grounded in a named cultural or structural mechanism, not a vague sense of misfit, but a specific process of distortion you can articulate. The fourth gives you flexibility. Use Alina Skye as your case anchor or apply the framework to a population from your own professional context and care. That second column, where it falls short, is where today's learning objective lies. When you articulate a specific mechanism of distortion grounded in a real client context, you are demonstrating Bloom's evaluate. That is the work. As we close, I want to leave you with this single frame for the week. You have moved through matching theory, developmental theory, and a critical lens that sharpens how you apply both what fits, how it unfolds, and whose assumptions we carry. Those are the 3 questions that have organized everything we covered today. Before you go, hold on to this. A person's worth is not their productivity. A career is relational, developmental, and culturally situated. And the most important thing a counselor carries into the room is the conviction that the client's life, as it has been lived, is already meaningful. That conviction is not a theory. It is an ethic. Take it with you. These are the primary sources cited throughout this presentation, formatted in APA. I want to highlight two in particular. Tang's 2019 text, chapters 3 and 4, directly supports this week's required readings and offers excellent applied grounding for the comparison chart assignment. Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies provides the deepest theoretical foundation for the critical lens we have been working from today. If you want to extend your thinking on any of these ideas, those two are strong starting points.